Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Elisabeth Forster. I'm a lecturer in Chinese history at the University of Southampton, and today I'd like to talk to you about the May 4th movement, also known as the New Culture movement in China's 19-teens and 1920s. And I'd like to start by looking at a source with you. So what you see here in the picture is the New Youth Journal. Now, the New Youth Journal is the most famous journal of the May 4th movement. And it is the most famous one because it discusses ideas associated with the May 4th movement, and because many of its authors were known as the stars, the centers, the heroes of the May 4th movement. And the New Youth Journal really embodies the May 4th movement in a variety of ways, and it really starts with a title and with a cover of this journal. So the title is New Youth. It contains the word new, and this points to a certain iconoclasm, so the whole idea of getting rid of the old and introducing something new. And you also see that it has a French subtitle, namely La Jeunesse, meaning the youth in French. And what that tells us or indicates is that many of these ideas negotiated in the May 4th movement actually had a Western inspiration, reinvented Western ideas. And all these ideas are actually absolutely crucial to the May 4th movement or the New Culture movement. Now, in order to avoid any confusion, I'll first have to explain the terms a little bit. And these terms are New Culture movement and May 4th movement. Actually, these two can mean the same, namely when they refer to certain cultural changes in the late 19-teens as well as in the 1920s. And these cultural changes include this iconoclasm that I already mentioned, an admiration for science and democracy, women's rights, so women's emancipation, advocacy of a new language, of language reform, changes to the whole social system, the family system, so for example away from arranged marriages towards people choosing their own partners on the basis of love, advocacy of individualism as well, and this is very important, the rise of communism in China. Now, additionally, this expression May 4th movement can refer to political protests that started on the 4th of May 1919, and they were directed against a certain clause in the Treaty of Versailles that was disadvantageous to China. I'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit. Now, some scholars have argued that May 4th / New Culture is the time when China became modern, and that does make sense in light of these various ideals that I just talked about. However, modernity is actually a really tricky concept when it comes to China, and the reason is that some scholars have argued that using the concept of modernity on places such as China is actually imperialist. And the reason why they have argued this is that what counted as modern in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and this is the time that we're talking about here, was actually derived from Europe and from America. And these were places that colonized or semi-colonized places like China at the time. So this isn't so much contested when it's about about material culture. So this isn't contested when it's about material culture, because basically a functioning bathroom, which would be one of the manifestations of material modernity, is the same in London as it would be in Beijing. But it becomes trickier and more interesting when it comes to non-material culture, to intellectual ideals, social ideas. And in that case, is an intellectual idea, an ideal, really more modern because it is derived from a European source, from a European ideal than from a Chinese one. So, for example, language reform. One of the ideas that were advocated in the May 4th movement by some intellectuals was to adjust the Chinese language to a degree to European languages. Now, is this really modern? Is this just imitating the West? And if China does something else, is that then automatically less modern? And based on these sorts of considerations, scholars then asked if there may be alternative ways of being modern, multiple ways of being modern. Now, I don't want to go into this in too much detail. This was a debate waged among scholars, especially in the 90s and 2000s. If you're interested in these debates, I recommend reading this introduction in this book by Susan Daruvala, which is really a great overview over these debates. Now, in order to get to May 4th, we first have to go back to the 19th century, and the reason is that way we can understand why we have all these Western, possibly modern ideas in China to begin with in the early 20th century. Now, in the 19th century, China was ruled by the Qing dynasty, and the Qing dynasty was huge in terms of its territory, and from within its ideology, saw itself as a civilizational center of the world. And the idea from within this ideology, at least theoretically, was that people coming from other parts of the world were barbarians. And the further away you got from China and from the imperial court, the more barbarian it gets. And I'm speaking from Britain. Here, Britain is very far geographically away from China, so obviously this here would be considered very barbarian indeed from a Qing dynasty perspective. Now, this self-image of extreme self-confidence collapsed when China encountered the West, especially Western imperialism in the 19th century. And keywords here are the Opium Wars. For example, the first Opium War ran from 1839 to 42. And all we need to know today for the purpose of this lecture here is that China lost this war, which was waged against Britain, and again, Britain is very far away from China. So from within this Qing dynasty ideology that I just mentioned, Britain would have been seen as barbarian, and losing against such barbarians in a war was a huge shock to the Qing dynasty's self-confidence. And then over the next few decades, the Qing dynasty continued losing wars against other Western powers. And this was not just a shock to the self-confidence. This had some real-life impact. So China, every time the Qing dynasty had lost a war, it had to give away political rights, territorial rights, economic rights. So this was extremely humiliating for the Qing dynasty. And therefore, unsurprisingly, Chinese policymakers at the time said, okay, we need to change this. And they said, well, in order to change this, we need to learn the secret of Western strength. And first they said, well, actually the secret of Western strength lies in Western weapons. I think that's quite intuitive. So they said, okay, we'll just have to buy a few of those Western weapons. Right. But then something interesting happened. They said in a second wave of trying to tackle imperialism in the 19th century, well, actually the secret of Western strength not only lies in the Western weapons, but also in Western science, which intuitively makes sense because you obviously have to maintain and repair the weapons, and for that you need to understand the underlying science. But then they said, and this is really interesting, the secret of Western strength also lies in Western culture. And thanks to this diagnosis these Chinese policymakers made in the 19th century, you have a large-scale import of Western ideas into China in the 19th century. So you have translation on a large scale of scientific works, philosophical works, of novels, and so on and so forth. And this reaches its peak in the late 19-teens and then connects itself to a political event, namely the May 4th demonstrations. In order to understand the May 4th demonstrations, we need as a background the First World War. Actually, people in China didn't care all too much about that First World War. Very often they didn't call it the Great War rather than the European War, which sort of indicates, well, this is a matter that interests people in Europe, it's not our problem. However, since China's overarching goal was to rid itself of imperialism, China at some point figured out a way to use this First World War for this purpose. Namely, in 1917, China saw a chance to use this war to rid itself at least of German imperialism. Now, Germany, like most other Western powers, had colonial concessions in China, in Shandong province. It's highlighted here for you on the map. So China, therefore, in 1917, entered the war on the side of the Entente, and the hope was that once the war was won by the Entente, China would then have a seat at the peace negotiations, which would be those at Versailles, and then that way it could use that to get those German colonial concessions back. Now, this was a solid plan. The problem was just Japan. So Japan also had entered the war on the side of the Entente, and for reasons that are a different story, not for today, Japan was politically quite strong on the international stage and gained in strength. Now, Japan had occupied Germany's colonial concessions in 1914 and then concluded various treaties with Britain and other Entente countries that said, well, Japan can keep these formerly German colonial concessions in China after the war. Now, fast forward to 1919, the peace conference in Versailles is convening, the Treaty of Versailles is being produced, and this Treaty of Versailles does give those formerly German colonial concessions to Japan rather than returning them to China. And in early May, it becomes clear to the Chinese public, or at least those parts that are interested in these political matters, that this will now not be changed anymore in this Treaty of Versailles. And therefore, on the 4th of May, 1919, students in Beijing, which was then as now the capital of China, start to protest. And they start to protest on the square of the Gate of Heavenly Peace, and then march to the diplomats' quarter, invade the home of a pro-Japanese minister. The minister himself has escaped, but they find a guest of the minister, so they beat up that guest, and then they burn down the house. And soon these protests spread to cities all over the country, and in the end, actually, China does not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and it does get back those German colonial concessions a couple of years later. Now, what does that have to do with all these cultural innovations that I talked about earlier? Well, there are different views on this. I actually have a different view from the one I'm about to present, so if you're interested in my view, I recommend that you read my book, the title of which you have here on the PowerPoint slide. A standard view is that both these May 4th protests against this particular clause in the Treaty of Versailles, as well as these cultural innovations, were all anti-imperialist, and also that both shared a general sense of the new. And whatever the reasons for the connection between the cultural innovations and these May 4th protests, the two did end up getting connected in the middle of 1919. And thereby, these political protests and the interest they incited in the country, in China, gave increasing traction to these cultural ideals. And this is when we have the idea of the new culture movement emerging. And as I said earlier, the new culture movement encompasses very many ideas, but today I'll just zoom in on two of those, namely women's emancipation and communism. So first about women's emancipation. But previously, women in China had a fairly low social status. This is not peculiar to China at all. This is a phenomenon you find in very many places in the world. Rich women, or women from a wealthy family background, could get some education. There has been very interesting research pointing out, okay, these women actually engage in literary production. However, they did not have the same opportunities as men at all. Now, marriages were arranged by people's parents, by their families, and there was a system of polygamy in place whereby one man, if he was wealthy enough, could have several wives. Now, on May 4th, these ideals changed. Women now should be more equal to men. Marriage partners should be chosen on the basis of love, not family arrangements. Women should get more and more education, and they should be able to work to earn their own money increasingly. Monogamy became the main system, and then at some point the sole system within which one could be married. So in other words, there's really the sense of iconoclasm, if you will, overthrowing the old and founding something new. And this had very many interesting manifestations. And one manifestation is a novel, one of the most famous modern Chinese novels by an author called Ding Ling. You see her in the picture here. And the novel is called Miss Sophie's Diary. That is a very short novel about a woman that would be seen as a modern woman, or a new woman as they were often also called. And this woman is called Miss Sophie. Now, Miss Sophie lives alone. She spends a lot of time with her friends. She has one male admirer who is a very nice and kind guy, but she is in love with a good-looking, not-so-nice man. And the novel is about her being torn, being quite nasty to that very nice man, and giving expression to her romantic feelings and interests in this very good-looking, not-so-nice man. And the very revolutionary thing about this novel, Miss Sophie's Diary, is that this is the first time a woman having this sort of agency and expressing herself in this way is depicted. So this is the realm of fiction, where you have really important changes with this aspect of women's emancipation of the May 4th movement. in real life, there were also a lot of changes. For example, Beijing University, which is the most prestigious university in China then as now, employed its first female professor in 1920, and the professor's name was Chen Hangzhou, or Sophia Chen. But as with, I guess, most things in life, there were very many sides to this particular coin. So, for example, many young male students who were involved in the May 4th movement were actually already married within arranged marriages. So they were students, but they married very young, or their parents had arranged marriages at a very young age. So these young men very often came from provincial towns or villages that were more conservative. And so they came to the big cities like Beijing and Shanghai and were exposed to all these very, very new ideas. And thereby their ideal of what a woman should be like obviously also changed. And now suddenly they were quite disappointed with these more conservative, if you will, wives they had back home. And many of them therefore divorced these wives. And now, from the perspective of these divorced wives, this was not actually a good development at all in favor of their rights, because within their particular social context, which was of a more conservative nature, being divorced deprived them of their previous social status and also their financial security. And later on, a very emancipated woman who had her own job, she talked to a scholar who interviewed her and said to her, well, actually, things didn't actually become better for women at that point in time, because so this woman said, previously men just married a new woman when they felt like it, and the first wife still remained in the family as the wife, so she still had her financial security and her social status. Whereas now, what all that's happening is that a man will just divorce his first wife and marry a new one, and then that deprives this former wife of her social status and her financial security. A very interesting case is also Zhang Shenfu. He was a young man involved in the May 4th movement, very pro women's emancipation. He, many decades later, talked to a scholar, Vera Schwartz, who then wrote an absolutely amazing book, Time for Telling the Truth is Running Out, in which she tells us that Zhang Shenfu himself then said, well, actually, one of my main motivations for becoming involved in this women's emancipation was that enabled him to have what today we would call open relationships with women, which he wouldn't have been able to do previously in that context. Still, it's really important to note that personal experience is absolutely diverse. So, for example, some May 4th men were also very different. So one of the most famous ones, Hu Shi, a very famous May 4th intellectual, he was in an arranged marriage to one of these more traditional conservative women. And he said, well, she doesn't fit my ideal of a new and modern woman, but she is my wife and I will not divorce her. So there was a huge diversity of experience resulting from women's emancipation of the May 4th movement. A second aspect of the May 4th movement that I want to talk about is communism. And that is really important because it ends with the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party. It doesn't so much end, it results in it in 1921. And I say it doesn't end because that is the same Chinese Communist Party that is still governing China until the present. Now, communism was known before May 4th. It had come into China with its general import of Western ideas since the 19th century, but there was actually barely any interest in it. When the October Revolution happened in Russia in 1917, that did incite some more interest in communism among Chinese intellectuals, but not too much at all. And it was only after the May 4th protests of 1919 that communism really gained traction. And one reason was that the May 4th protests were almost, or could be read as a form of a mass movement, and intellectuals became interested in the power of the masses, in connecting with the masses, and this obviously then gave attraction to communist ideas. Another factor that is really important is that Soviet agents at the time were also sent into the world to promote world revolutions. A world revolution is the idea that the revolution shouldn't just happen in one place, but in the whole world. and some of these agents also made it to China, and they helped with the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 in Shanghai. And one man who was present in 1921 in Shanghai when the party was founded was Mao Zedong. We see him here as a young man in the picture. Mao Zedong, of course, would be the leader of socialist China in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So to sum this up, the May 4th movement, I guess most people would argue, was really a very important turning point in modern Chinese history. You have ideas like women's emancipation or communism gaining traction, but also many other ideas such as science and democracy, language reform, and so on. And scholars have in the past debated if this should be called modernity. And when they have debated this, the question they ask is less, well, was there something new? Of course it was something new. But the question is rather, is modernity always Western? And if it is always Western, should we really be using it to talk about China? Will we be replicating imperialist patterns of looking at China? Or even less politically, do we maybe overlook things that are new and interesting and fascinating in China but don't quite fit this lens of modernity? And at least in my view, I think it would be quite a pity if we overlook these things. Well, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the lecture.